Race Talk Revolution, where your voice matters. I'm your host and founder of Race Talk Revolution Incorporated, Reverend Lane Cobb, and my usual partner and co-host, Reverend Eugene Holden, is taking some time off from this broadcast, and stepping into the co-host role this week with me is Catholic social ethicist and racial justice advocate and award-winning author, Alex McCulloch. Alex is the author of Unlearning White Supremacy, A Spirituality of Racial Liberation, published by Orbis Books, and it is available on Amazon. Our speaker today is award-winning author and historian, Dr. Shannen D. Williams. Her book, Subversive Habits, Black Catholic Nuns in the Long African-American Freedom Struggle, provides the first full history of Black Catholic nuns in the United States, hailing them as the forgotten prophets of Catholicism and democracy. Drawing on oral histories and previously sealed church records, Williams demonstrates how master narratives of women's religious life and Catholic commitments to racial and gender justice fundamentally change when the lives and experiences of African-American nuns are taken seriously. We are so blessed to have her. As always, during our conversation today, we ask that you please remain muted. And when you get to the Q&A section, we're going to instruct you how to raise your hand. And then we'll invite you to activate your camera if you're not currently on camera and express your questions and comments. At that time, we'll also ask you to please try to keep your questions and comments to under 1 minute. We also remind you that Race Talk Revolution is a loving, inclusive platform that is designed to strip away the false beliefs that we are somehow separate, and to uncover the not so hidden truth that we all want and need the same things in life. We are committed to healing the wounds created by systemic racism. Race Talk Revolution is a safe and brave space for people of all backgrounds to share their ideas and opinions and to explore the nuances of systemic racism while together growing our capacity for effective anti-racist activism. The Race Talk Revolution community is committed to practicing radically inclusive love so that even when we don't understand or agree someone else's perspective, we listen with compassion and respect and appreciation, because it's our commitment here that every person is appreciated, everyone is heard, everyone is encouraged, because here in Race Talk Revolution, every voice matters. And now I'm going to turn the mic over to Alex.
Well, good morning and good afternoon, Race Talk Revolution family. I am so delighted to introduce our speaker today. Dr. Shannen D. Williams is Associate Professor of History at the University of Dayton. She is an award-winning scholar of the African-American experience and Black Catholicism with research and teaching specializations in women's, religious, and Black freedom movement history. She is also the author of the book she'll be discussing today, Subversive Habits, Black Catholic Nuns in the Long African-American Freedom Struggle, which is published by Duke University Press, and it provides the first full history of Black Catholic sisters in the United States. Dr. Williams holds a bachelor's in history with magna cum laude and Phi Beta Kappa honors from Agnes Scott College, a master's degree in Afro-American Studies from the University of Wisconsin at Madison, and a PhD in history from Rutgers University. A lifelong Catholic, Dr. Williams also authored the award-winning column, The Griot's Cross, for the Catholic News Service. Reverend Lane and I are delighted, just so delighted to welcome Professor Williams, and we are so eager to learn about your journey into historical truth telling. And Professor Williams, if you could start off by just sharing, how did you discover this story? How did this all get started?
Thank you, Reverend Cobb and Dr. and Alex, just for the opportunity. I'm just so honored to be with you to be with you this morning / afternoon. Although I'm a lifelong Catholic, I did not know any Black Catholic history outside of my family's own personal history. One would think as a Black Catholic woman, of course, I would be interested in Black Catholic women's history, but I had no interest going into graduate school, first at the University of Wisconsin at Madison or even at Rutgers. I was really interested in women's activism and leadership in the Black freedom movement and specifically within the Black power movement. And so I went into graduate school looking for a topic that had not necessarily been told to give us greater insights into what Black power looked like in the 1960s and 1970s. I came to this project really by chance, although I think it's better to say providential serendipity. I was probably supposed to write this project and begin this project when I was at the University of Wisconsin at Madison. There, I wrote a master's thesis on Joan Victoria Byrd, who was one of the two women co-defendants in the New York Panther 21 trial from 1969 to 1971. And I was drawn to her story in part because she was, you know, a young girl. She was actually Catholic. And what was really interesting about her story is that her respectability, the fact that she came from a good, upwardly mobile Black Catholic family, had attended Catholic schools and was a nursing student, should not have been involved with the Panthers, or at least that's the way in which the media tried to frame her story. And so I was really interested in sort of thinking about, let's see if any other sort of people from religious backgrounds who were considered to be conservative went into organizations like the Black Panther Party. And so I went to Rutgers thinking about that. And so I actually came to this project in my first seminar in African-American history taught by Dr. Deborah Gray Wyatt, who was a pioneer of Black women's history. And so I thought I was going to write about the Panthers. And I said, no, I want to impress my professor. So I literally, and not to say that that wouldn't impress my professor, but I was like, well, a lot of people write about the Panthers. So let's go see if I can find something else. And so I literally went to our library and started going through microfilmed editions of Black-owned newspapers, seeing if I could sort of find other stories of folks who were involved in the Black Power movement, looking for a story that had not been written about. And while I was going through an edition of the Pittsburgh Courier, which was a nationally distributed Black-owned newspaper, I stumbled upon this article announcing the formation of a Black Power Federation of Catholic Nuns called the National Black Sisters Conference in 1968 in Pittsburgh at what was then Mount Mercy College, which is now Carlow University. And I experienced what I can only call a metanoia. More than the article's title itself, it was this image of four smiling Black Catholic nuns that steadied my hand. Again, I, a lifelong Catholic, had never seen a Black nun. I did not know that they existed. And I said, oh my goodness, well, here we go. This is the project. And so I learned, I started going through the article. You know, I did a very 21st century thing and Googled the National Black Sisters Conference, found that they were still an entity, but also that their papers had just been archived at Marquette University and in the previous few years had been deposited there. So I knew this was the project. But also what I did that evening was I called my mother. Although I didn't know a lot of Black Catholic history, I did know my mother's story. My mother did not come from a Catholic family. She converted to Catholicism when she was 7 years old. And her story was like many individuals who became Catholic in the middle of the 20th century, that she was educated in Catholic schools and converted in Savannah, Georgia. My mother is also one of the first 3 Black women to graduate from the University of Notre Dame. So she's in that first class of women graduates in 1974. And so I called my mom and she said, you know, I asked her, I was like, Mom, did you know there were Black nuns? And she was like, no. But she said something to me that also affirmed to me that I was on track with the project. She said, no, but I wish I had known. I wish we'd had Black nuns when I was growing up in Savannah. And I'd never heard my mother talk about her experiences before. And I should also say, I didn't do Black Catholic history because my mother does not talk about her experiences as the first Black woman to graduate from the University of Notre Dame. It's not something that she ever talks about. And that's the plight of the pioneer. It's too difficult. Only recently, like within the past year, has she begun to sort of say certain things about Notre Dame and even about her experiences. And she also said, you know, we were never taught about Black nuns. We were also never taught Black history in our schools. And for me, what was really shocking is that when I started the research, almost immediately, I went to what was then and what is still the only history of Black Catholicism in the United States, written by Father Cyprian Davis, who is the Dean of Black Catholic History. And I learned that there had been 2 historically Black sisterhoods founded in Savannah, where my mother was born. And so what was also shocking to me was that my mother's journey into Catholicism had in part been laid by the efforts of these heroic Black nuns who then got ran out of town in the late 19th century, early 20th century due to white supremacy, and then who were erased by the women who took over their ministries. And so for me, I think I knew in 2007 that I had to write this book. However, I didn't know what I would find, but I just knew that I would have to write this book. And when I started tracking down some of the women who founded the National Black Sisters Conference, that's when I began to realize how big the project was and how important the story was.
And so could you talk about why write this book? And as you talk about that, like, you know, it is really amazing how your research changes our understanding of the origins of the nation. So, go ahead.
Absolutely. So, you know, after I realized, right, that, you know, okay, here's a story here that's not been told, you know, I wrote my paper for my my class, my seminar. My professor knew it. You know, everyone who, you know, was with me from the very beginning, they were like, oh, this is going to be big. We didn't know what we would find, but they just understood that it would be big. And what was interesting is I started tracking down some of the women, some of whom were still in religious life and others who were not, who had founded the National Black Sisters Conference. And one of the first people that I tracked down was Dr. M. Shawn Copeland, who is a distinguished theologian, has recently retired from Boston College, and also the first Black president of the Catholic Theological Society of America. And she was the founding executive director of the National Black Sisters Conference. And she, perhaps more so than anyone else, had done the most to ensure that that organization's history would not be erased. She had their papers. And so when she left Marquette to go to Boston College, where she retired, from which she retired, she left the papers at Marquette and got them archived. Also in the late 1970s, she was one of the conference's most visible public figures. And so she was doing all this writing, theological writing, but also historical writing, that the women who founded the National Black Sisters Conference, these Black nuns who came of age during Black Power, did what their counterparts did. They went in search of their foremothers and forefathers in church. And so they had started writing all of these articles, documenting their history in the church. And in 1975, Dr. Copeland, who was then Sister M. Shawn Copeland, who was the first African-American Felician sister in Detroit, was also later an Adrian Dominican sister, had written an article in the National Catholic Reporter entitled Black Nuns: An Uneasy Story. And it was the first attempt to provide a survey of Black sisters in the United States. And so she said something to me when she agreed to allow me to interview her. She said, you know, we've been waiting on somebody to tell this story. I'm so glad you're interested. You know, and the piece of it was, I wasn't sure I was going to be able to do it unless I was able to track down the foundress, the chief architect of the National Black Sisters Conference, who is Dr. Patricia Gray, but who was formerly Sister M. Martin de Porres Gray, who was Pittsburgh's first Black religious sister of mercy. So everyone who will tell you anything that you can find from that period will tell you that she was one of the most charismatic and most intellectually talented sisters of her generation. She left religious life abruptly in 1974 and stopped giving interviews. So most people, when I was trying to track her down, they were like, she won't talk to you. You know, she turned down the producer's Eyes on the Prize back in the day because she did not want to talk about her experiences in religious life. I had to I wrote her, I called her, it didn't work. I eventually had to sort of find one of her foremost secretaries, and she put me on a three-way call. And then I still had to go to her home. She needed to see me. And I spent like a weekend with her. And that's how she finally felt comfortable speaking with me. And what's interesting, you know, during our conversation, you know, she really made me promise to a certain extent, you know, that I would not write a book about her or even the National Black Sisters Conference, or even a story of Black nuns and Black power. She understood, even though she didn't know the history, right? She didn't know all that was there. She said, the story is bigger than that. And she really encouraged me, gently, but very, very much encouraged me to make sure that I included the largely unsung and under-researched history of the nation's Black sisterhoods. There have been 8 in the United States, and it's the Black sisterhoods that made religious life possible, not only for Black women, but certainly their successes helped to mitigate some of that longstanding opposition to the ordination of Black men, to the priesthood. And so, you know, she's very adamant that I look to those sisters because the vast majority of Black women who went into religious life in the United States joined the Black orders because white communities would not take them for quite some time. And even now, there are still formal and informal policies in place. And then she said something again. She said, you know, we were not, and she's talking about the National Black Sisters Conference, we were not the first sisters to revolt in the church. If you can, try to tell all of our stories. And it was really her that helped me and who encouraged me, but also helped me to feel confident enough that I could, in fact, go do this work and to go on this journey for 14 years to track down current and former sisters, get access to archives, and piece together this history from every source that I could find. And that's why I wrote the history. I wrote it because these are women who are among the nation's oldest Black church women. These are women who can trace their lineage to the earliest days of the church, reminding us that Black history has always been Catholic history, whose stories remind us that the Catholic Church has never been an innocent bystander in the history of white supremacy through its participation in colonialism, slavery, and segregation. In fact, one cannot tell Black sister stories accurately and honestly without confronting this sin history of white supremacy through those systems of exploitation and power. And what was really striking for me was that these are women who left records. These are some of the most highly educated women in the nation. The two oldest Black sisterhoods in the United States, which are also the two oldest Black sisterhoods in the modern Atlantic world, have archives. These are women who led schools, who broke some of the nation's oldest and most difficult racial and gender barriers. They've left us records behind. And so I really had to grapple with the fact that this history wasn't lost to us, that it was suppressed. And what I came to realize very quickly is that when you are confronted with the silence past, the greatest responsibility of the historian and the most radical thing that any person can do is to tell the story that was never meant to be told. And so what I found was that when you tell Black sister stories, so many of the stories that we've accepted about the Catholic past actually are revealed to be myths. And the truth, what one of the 3 African-American nuns who are currently on the road to sainthood in the United States called us to do, to tell that true truth, leaves us very uneasy. But that's ultimately why I wrote Subversive Habits, because too many forces had colluded to suppress this history. And I'll just say it was a difficult journey, to say the very least.
So Dr. Williams, when I took an African American religious history course in college, and it was very much focused on Protestant traditions. Could you talk a little bit about how what you found changes our understanding of the origins of the Atlantic slave trade and also of the United States?
Absolutely. So what's interesting, right? Even though in the United States, the vast majority of Christians are members of independent Protestant denominations, Black denominations, we have to remember that Catholicism is the first articulation of Christianity in what becomes the United States. Our history does not begin in Virginia in 1619. The Catholic Church inaugurated African slavery in what becomes the United States almost a century earlier. We know that enslaved and free African descended people are a part of these earliest Spanish expeditions into the Americas. But we look at the nation's oldest town, right, St. Augustine in Florida, in 1565, that is the formal birthplace not only of Catholic history, but also Black history. Even if we sort of think about the church, not every Black person who was living in the colonial period under Catholic auspices is enslaved, but many of them are. But we know that there are free people there. In fact, in St. Augustine, it's the first Christian marriage that takes place in what becomes the United States, and it's between a free Black Catholic woman from Seville, Spain, and a Spanish soldier. So that history is a bit more complicated. When I say Black history is Catholic history and Catholic history is Black history, I mean this because so much of early African-American history takes place within Catholic boundaries. When we think about the first route, like for African-Americans seeking freedom in what becomes the United States, is into the South, right? Into Spanish Florida. For those who make it from these British or French-controlled territories that can make it into Spanish Florida, if they are Catholic already, or if they agree to convert to Catholicism and take up arms against Spain's enemies, that they can gain their freedom. So there is this beautiful history that is there. And then certainly if we're looking at the French-controlled territories as well. When we talk about the Catholic Church, unfortunately, we always focus on sort of the church beginning really in the mid-19th century, and it's an immigrant, a European immigrant church, right? That sort of begins in these northern cities in the Midwest, right? That's the whole, that's sort of what we understand as sort of the mainland of, the Catholic Church. But in fact, right, the early church, the foundational church, is a Southern church. The cradles of U.S. Catholicism are in Florida, or in Maryland, or in Kentucky, and Missouri, and Louisiana. And while African Americans make up a relatively small portion of the current national population, if we're talking about the early American church, African descended people make up significant portions, and in some cases they dominate sort of the faithful. In a place like Louisiana, by the early 19th century, it is a Black female dominated church. So this idea of us thinking about Black Catholics as the minority within a minority really obscures the foundational African roots of American Catholicism. We have to remember that there are two transatlantic stories of American Catholicism, one that begins in Europe and another one that also begins with African descended people who are living in Europe, but also as a result of all of those who are forced into the Americas as a result of the transatlantic slave trade. The Catholic Church is the first global institution to say that Black people didn't matter, that their lives didn't matter, that they inaugurate through a series of papal bulls beginning in the 15th century, say that we can be enslaved in perpetuity, which is new, right? That's something that's new. The church is deeply involved at every turn. And in fact, what historians of Latin America and the Caribbean have been screaming at us and saying is that we need to stop making US synonymous with American. Because if we look at the American Catholic Church, looking at Canada, the United States, and Latin America and the Caribbean, the vast majority of people who have lived their lives under the signposts of Catholicism in the Americas have been people of African and indigenous descent, not European. And so when we think about telling Black sister stories, so many of the women, both the earliest generations of Black nuns, but also those who are still with us, can trace their lineage to the earliest days of the church, of not only to sort of the free and enslaved African descended people whose labor and suffering and faithfulness built the church, but many of them who are descendants of the earliest European Catholics in what becomes the United States. So to give you one example, in the case of an early Oblate Sister of Providence, who was born Anne Marie B. Craft, who became Sister Mary Aloysius. Many of you may know her name. Her name has come up as a result of Georgetown University's efforts to make reparations for its slaveholding past, and they renamed one of the halls after her. She, in 1820, when she's just 15 years old, founds the first school, what will become the first Catholic school for Black girls in Washington, D.C. We know her father, William B. Craft, was very much well-respected in the Catholic community in Washington, D.C., in the Georgetown community. What we know also from the historical record that her father was, according to the AME, the first history of the AME Church, because one of the early AME bishops married into the B. Craft family, that he was the natural son of Charles Carroll of Carrollton, which is a direct quote. Charles Carroll of Carrollton is the only Catholic signer of the Declaration of Independence. He is cousin to Bishop John Carroll, who was the first Catholic bishop of the United States. They are slaveholders. Charles Carroll, in fact, is one of Maryland's largest slaveholders and an early benefactor of the church. And so in the case of Anne Marie B. Craft, she is literally the only Catholic sister that we know who has a literal birthright, not only to the early nation, but also to the early church. And so you have women who, early sisters and some sisters who are still with us, who have deep connections to the Carrolls, these early American European Catholic families, the Spaldings, which also give the nation two early bishops and a leader of a congregation. And the Pintados, which are a Spanish Catholic family who do much of the surveying of Spanish Louisiana and Florida. One of the early Sisters of the Holy Family in New Orleans is a descendant of the Pintado family. And so you have all of these connections who are there. And again, their stories remind us that one, as much as we know that anti-Catholicism was real, right? The Catholic Church at various moments in Florida, Louisiana, Kentucky, Missouri, Louisiana are some of the nation's first and largest slaveholders, that they are not innocent bystanders in this story. And slavery under Catholicism is just as violent as it is under other religious auspices, right? Like, we know that the Jesuits are whipping enslaved women naked. We know that they have to be told not to whip pregnant enslaved women. We know that they are trading in human flesh and doing all of this foolishness. We also know that part of what this story also forces us to grapple with too is that the roots of the American church's sex abuse crisis also lies in slavery. We have examples. We haven't been looking, so there are plenty more there, but we already have examples. And so what was striking for me as a Black Catholic woman who knew nothing about Black Catholic history, who knew nothing about the history of Black Catholic women and girls, was that when we begin to narrate the history of the US Church from the perspective of Black women and girls, which we can do, because so much of their history is older than that of their European counterparts, that story fundamentally changes. And the church is not what it said it was, right? That it was this persecuted religious minority that was forced to accept the prejudices of the time, right? That they are themselves very much a part of the founding and participating in the shaping of American white supremacy and its culture. And they do it as members of their church, but also as elected officials, as slaveholders, that we really have to grapple with.
And so just to step back a moment, could you talk, I'm not sure that people know the terms nuns and sisters.
Right.
And just talk about, those terms and how you use them. And then begin to, if you could share about why oral histories were so critical to telling these stories.
Absolutely. So first, so I will, and I do this also in my book, when I mean, or sort of, I use the term sister and nun interchangeably, but there are important differences between the two. A Roman Catholic nun is a woman who has professed vows and lives in a cloister setting with minimal contact with the secular world. Generally, her primary, vocation is prayer. A sister, in contrast, is a woman who has professed vows but engages in public works like teaching, nursing, or social work. Because sisters participate in the religious life of the church, they are both called women religious. And so most of the Black women who went into religious life are sisters, meaning that they engage in sort of have these public ministries. But nuns and sisters use those terms interchangeably, so I do the same. But again, I just wanted to make sure that a nun is someone who primarily does not have a lot of contact with the world. Her primary vocation is prayer. They may also be engaged in sort of works where they may, craft beer. You see some of these amazing stories, like of sister nuns crafting beer, or they make breads or certain things like that. Whereas a sister is someone who is engaging in public ministries. And tell me say the second question again, I'm sorry.
No, just about how important oral histories,
Right.
practice of oral histories is so critical to this book.
Right. So, Subversive Habits draws on a host of sources, right? Archival sources. I, spent incredible amount of time with the two older sisterhoods, the Oblate Sisters of Providence, founded in Baltimore in 1829, and the Sisters of the Holy Family in 1842. In the case of the third surviving African-American sisterhood, the Franciscan Handmaids of the Most Pure Heart of Mary, which were founded in Savannah, Georgia in 1916, but then were forced to relocate to Harlem in 1923. And they are now actually in Nigeria under the leadership of their first non-American superior. They did not have an archive. They at one time had it, no one knows where the records are. Somebody says that they're sort of with the priest who sort of founded them, but I never got any access to that community. So I was able to sort of use the personal archives of their surviving members, including obituaries, to sort of pull together the stories of sisters. I also was able to sort of get access to previously sealed records. So for example, if a sister did not remain in religious life, her records are closed, especially if she went into a white community. And so oftentimes the records are closed, so I had to get special permission. Sometimes you have to get special permission to congregational minutes, which is where sisters do all of their business. And so having all of those records, it was still not enough. Now, I started with oral histories initially because I started this in graduate school. I was in the middle of the semester. I had a list of sisters' names, and I could not go to the archive at Marquette during the semester. So I literally just started calling and writing mother houses to see if I could interview these women. And so I started doing oral history interviews simply because I did not have access, because I was in graduate school in the middle of the semester, not doing the work, not close to Marquette to be able to sort of go and do the archival work. When I first started doing the oral history interviews, I knew that it was important because I realized there's so much within the archive that I would never be able to get access to. And there's just something so rich about oral histories. So much of those details will never be preserved in a traditional archive. So I started doing oral histories, and I did about 45 for the dissertation and did over 100 more. Most of the there's a significant portion, not a most, but a significant portion of those interviews that I can't use. Many of the women who I talked to just needed to get it off of their chest. Many of them were older in their communities, and so they were very fearful of having their names and telling those stories. Many of them are dependent upon their communities for their care in their final years. Many of them are the last of their line, so they can't leave religious life. These are women who have spent 50, 60, 70 years in religious life. They don't have any Social Security, so they can't afford to risk alienating themselves in their communities. There are some stories that sisters that I know, but I just can't tell. There's one sister who I wanted to tell her story because she desegregated her public school. And while she told me her story, she said, I have a sibling who's passing for white, married with children, so if you name me, you expose my sibling, which is not something I was going to do. So there are a lot of stories that I'm hanging on to. But the stories were important because they helped me to understand many things. They gave me great insights to what Black Catholic life looked like under Jim Crow, outside of the violence. They testified to the faithfulness of these Black Catholic families, sort of the leadership of Black lay women in communities. Also, what's significant about the oral histories, and they give me insights into sort of, what the experience of life for those who participated in the Great Migration. So for example, there's this one Black sister in California, and she said, my family was one of the few African-American families that took Route 66 to California. Most African-Americans didn't take that route because most of the restaurants and hotels would not service African-Americans. But she said, my mother and my stepfather could pass for white. She said her biological father was a bit darker, so she and her siblings were brown. And she said, so one thing I can tell you about that trip, and it was like over 3 days, is that my siblings and I rode on the floor the entire time, because we would have exposed my mother and my stepfather. And so when her stepfather would go get a hotel, he would go get the key, and then he and her mother would wrap the kids in blankets and carry them into the hotel so that they would not be seen. You cannot get that from an archival record. That comes from the oral history record. Or one pioneering Black sister in Omaha, Nebraska, I asked her, so how did your family end up in Omaha? And she said, we were in Kansas. My father was a migrant worker. And one day while my father was away, my mom saw a white woman kick a Black child. And my mom was like, nope. And she sold a pig, left word for her father that they were moving on to another town so she could protect her children. They ended up in Omaha, and her father caught up with them. There's another sister in California, and I asked why her family left Texas. And she said, my grandmother was raped by a white man, and my mother is the product of it. And we had to get out of town. That's the oral history. But also as it relates to racial segregation and exclusion within women's religious life, we cannot even begin to understand how many Black women's vocations, women who were called to religious life, were lost to us. There's so much, even in the oral testimonies. When I started doing oral testimonies, again, I'm not somebody who knew Black Catholic history. I started interviewing the members of the Black sisterhoods. And I assumed, as in most communities, well, you joined the Black sisterhood because you were educated by that community, right? And the sisters were like, oh no, I was educated by this white order. I was educated by the Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament. I was educated by the BBM sisters. I had white nuns as educators. They rejected me, and I got lucky and was directed to the Black order. And so it was in those oral testimonies that I began to realize, right? So many of these women, we think about the courageous sort of acts of these women and the power of their calls to religious life. We're talking about women who are traveling hundreds and even thousands of miles away from their hometowns to be able to enter communities that will accept them. You know, prior to World War II, you know, with few exceptions, the only options that a visibly Black woman can have to go into religious life is to enter the Black orders. So if you wanted to be a nurse, right, you had very few options, right, because the Black orders were teaching communities. Indeed, that's something else that's so important for us to understand about the African-American sisterhoods. They were multi-ethnic communities and they were multilingual communities, because they are not only preserving the vocations of Black women and girls who are rejected entries into white communities in the United States, but also in Canada, in the Caribbean, and Latin America. So these are women who are getting lucky, who somebody knows that the Black orders exist in the United States and they're being tracked into these communities. Also, what's really interesting is, you know, as I say, we can't even begin to know how many vocations were lost to us. In the 1940s and 1950s, a white Jesuit priest began tracking this so we could have some numbers. But so many of the women that I interviewed, they said, you know, I didn't even write an application. And so I don't have a formal rejection. I asked my teacher or I asked the visiting vocational director. So the rejection is oral. So there's no written record of the rejection. So when we think about individual sisters and even communities that have these policies who say, you know, suppress the vocations by any means necessary, it's only through the oral histories that we begin to sort of figure out how they were actually doing it. Requesting photographs of Black girls. Like if they didn't preserve the applications, they said they asked for my photograph, right? For an application, why do you need to see what a sister looks like, right? But you need to do that when Catholic schools begin to integrate. And so you can't track if they don't identify themselves as Black, right? You know, how are you going to figure it out? So there are lots of examples like that. And I would also say one last thing, although I can say more about it with oral histories as well. For those sisters who have passed on, and you know, you asked about sort of some of the difficulties, right? And if there's anything that leaves me a lot leaves me profoundly uneasy. But a lot of these women were allowed to die and no one collected their oral testimonies. Women who had broken some of the nation's most important barriers. And so there's one sister, and it also took me a long time, in part because anytime that a sister would say yes to an interview, I would stop what I was doing and I'd take the interview, especially if she was over 65. And I did this because I'm almost early in my tenure, I'd had an interview scheduled with a former nun, and I was teaching and I said, okay, well, I'll interview in May after the semester, and she died. And I was distraught. And so oral history was also important for me. And for those who knew her story, I had to interview other sisters who knew what had happened to Dr. Irvin. And again, these are the things, and I'll tell this one last story. It's like, so she was from New York City, rejected admission into all the white communities in New York, applied to a community in Kentucky, was rejected admission into that community in Kentucky. She then goes and learns French for few years and then applies to that community in Kentucky, their mother house in France. And she's accepted in France. And so she goes, professes her final vows in France. And then as soon as after she professes her final vows, there's a request that comes from their community in Kentucky. They need a French teacher. And so her French superior, who accepted her, comes back with her into the United States, and she has to serve as a translator between the French superior who accepted her and the American superior who rejected her. That's oral history, right? So that's also why oral history is absolutely important. For those details, those stories that just don't get preserved in the archival record, oral history is absolutely essential, and it's invaluable.
Yeah, and one of the sisters who you talk about, who is really central throughout the book, who I had the great honor and blessing of meeting, was Sister Antona Ebo. And if you could, I think people would really appreciate hearing a bit of her story and how her story illuminates the struggles for Black Catholic sisters in the Catholic Church and with the broader Black freedom struggle.
Absolutely. Outside of the three African American sisters who are currently on the road to sainthood, Sister Mary Antona Ebo is probably the most famous, in part because she is among the inaugural delegation of Catholic nuns who go to march for voting rights in Selma, Alabama in 1965. So when nuns arrive in Selma in 1965, it's a thing, it's a media event because sisters had not really been participating, not in any national demonstrations. And so on the following day, images of sisters, and Sister Mary Antona Ebo is strategically put at the front of the march by Black leaders, appear across the country as an AP photograph. What's also very interesting with her, many people know her because when they did the documentary Sisters of Selma, she's featured, she tells her story. But like so many pioneering Black sisters in white communities, she is a desegregation pioneer. Even before she desegregates her community in 1946, she had desegregated her high school. And then like so many pioneering Black sisters in white communities, when you desegregate a community, you are not simply desegregating that community. You have to desegregate every convent, and a convent is literally just sort of the place where sisters live. So wherever your community has ministries, the convents, or they have convents there. So you have to desegregate the convents. Oftentimes you have to desegregate your orders, schools, if you are a teaching sister, or their hospitals, if you are a nursing sister. You have to desegregate the sundown towns and racially hostile towns in which many white Catholic institutions are located. And these are women who are doing this work outside of the protection of news cameras, right? Unlike sort of those, brave Black children who desegregate so many secular institutions, these are people who are doing it away from their hometowns, away from their home communities, oftentimes that had nurtured them. And they're doing so oftentimes in profound isolation. So Sister Mary Antona Ebo desegregates her community with 4 other women in 1946. And as a member of that pioneering generation of Black sisters in white communities, they will endure unconscionable racism. In fact, they are actually admitted on a segregated basis. Their community builds a separate novitiate, which is a training space for the sisters that they cannot be trained with their white counterparts. They enforce segregation in socializing, dining. They are not even allowed to enter their mother house during the first 4 years, and then when they're finally allowed to enter only through the back doors initially. They are also forced to profess their vows in a segregated ceremony, separate from their white counterparts, in the name of God. And there are other examples of Black sisters who were forced to profess their vows separately in the sacristy so as to not offend white parents or to enforce segregation. And so her story is significant because she endures, she stays. And at the very beginning, just to give you a sense of the kinds of humiliations and abuses that these women suffer, she tells as what is indeed a pivotal moment in her life and her understanding of herself as a Black woman and as a proud Black woman. Her father, in his final illness, attempted to go to one of her order's white hospitals, and a white nun invoked segregation and refused to admit him. And Sister Antona was not there. And she is told by someone who was there that he begged, he pleaded, he said, my sister is also a sister of St. Mary. And there had been sort of a community rule that she didn't necessarily understand, that the sisters could have, their family members could be treated at any hospital, but that wasn't true for the Black sisters. And so there's this moment, and she has this sort of moment, right? She understands the depths of white supremacy, right? In the minds and hearts of her white counterparts, right? The depths of it, right? That race comes before faith in the minds of these white Catholics, even those who minister to African Americans. And, she says, I made up that point in my time that they were never going to forget that I was my father's daughter, that I'm a Black woman. And so she becomes very outspoken, and she will go on to be a founding member of the National Black Sisters Conference. She goes on to lead that organization. What's interesting is when I decided to sort of frame that story, because she's not only in Selma, she not only has this sort of history, but even before Selma, right? Because she's desegregating her community, that it's not simply a struggle for civil rights. She'll be involved in the NAACP and whatnot, but there is also this history of desegregating white Catholic spaces, right? Even before we sort of even get to sort of this civil rights movement. And part of her story is helpful for us also because there is this myth that Black Catholics were somehow politically conservative or complacent with white supremacy and segregation, when in fact, if we turn our attention to Black sisters and look at all the barriers that they are able to break, they are able to pry open the doors of Catholic universities and colleges before the Brown decision. And someone like a Sister Antona Ebos, whose activism never breaks, right? Unlike many of her counterparts, we also know that in her 90th year, she is in Ferguson. And while we know that there were so many hundreds of Catholic sisters and priests and brothers who supported the Selma voting rights protest in 1965, either going to Selma or participating in sympathy marches, she's the only one who's in Ferguson calling for change before a crowd of reporters. And so she is that durable link within the church to the long Black freedom struggle, or what I would call that. The one thing that I did want to say, but I know that we may be running out of time, but I did want to say too, when she told me that story about what had happened to her father and some of the other abuses that she had suffered in the church, I trusted her, right? There was no reason for her to lie. I was able to find a photograph of the segregated profession ceremony too. So I knew that she was telling the truth. But when I began doing this research, I encountered so much resistance from so many forces. If you go to my book, you'll notice that I cite my interview with her, but I also cite a white scholar's interview with her where she also admits that, because so many people thought I was lying. So many people think these nuns are lying. And so not that I have all this archival evidence on the part of the order too. And so some people were like, well, why were you so meticulous with your footnotes? I was like, do you understand that people are not going to believe me? They're going to try to discredit me. And so I trusted the sisters. The oral histories are legitimate sources. They are enough. But I also wanted to make a point. You're not going to call me a liar, and you're not going to call this woman a liar in this community. And so that's also a part of why I took so much time, why I was sort of looking for corroborating evidence, if I only had the oral history, to be able to sort of make the point, just in case, for those who have been very much a part of the suppression of this history, to make sure, like, they're gonna have to say it publicly. You're gonna have to call me a liar public, and you're gonna have to call Sister Mary Antona Ebo a liar publicly, which you're not gonna do.
So, Alex, I think we're going to open the floor for Q&A, and I'll get to that in a moment. But first, I just want to thank Dr. Shannen D. Williams for your work. Thank you for this book. Thank you for being here today, because I am so moved by this information. This is so moving to tell the stories of people who have paved the way for what so many of us take for granted. And I wanted to ask you, I know that we spoke about this just briefly, but in the Catholic Church, right, for these Black sisters to be dealing with external and internal, like they're facing racism, but also misogyny, right? There's quite a bit of stuff that these people had to really push against. And I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit about that, and kind of what are some of the changes that Black sisters are pushing for internally in the church, and what's happening there?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that question. The misogyny was not something that I expected to encounter. I was shocked when I encountered it in the archive, when I realized why the story of Sister M. Martin de Porres had been erased in various sort of iterations of Black Catholic history. And I was surprised to encounter it in the contemporary period. Sister M. Martin DePorres Gray, who is the chief architect of the National Black Sisters Conference, is the only woman present at the founding meeting of the Black Catholic Clergy Caucus in 1968, just a few weeks after the assassination of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. She is invited by a Black priest who was visiting Pittsburgh, who was directed to sort of find her. She asked to come, and he says, yes, of course you can come. And then she encounters the founding members of the National Black Catholic Clergy Caucus. Very little attention has been paid to that initial meeting. If you go to any sort of written history of the Black Catholic Clergy Caucus, she is erased. Her presence is not there. And in the early 70s, she talked about her experience, a bit of it. She sort of says, you know, they tried to force me out. I sort of called them on their misogyny then. But, you know, and I say it's in no written history of the Black Catholic Clergy Caucus, as she mentioned, and that includes Father Cyprian Davis's landmark study of the Black Catholic community, the history of Black Catholics in the United States. And Father Cyprian Davis, again, is the Dean of Black Catholic History. He was a big champion of my research. When I was a young graduate student, he would always come to my talks. He was very supportive. I interviewed him for my project. But if you read his history, she's not there. And in fact, the National Black Sisters Conference is not even mentioned. It's only once in the timeline at the very end of the book. And Father Cyprian is a founding member of the Black Catholic Clergy Caucus. He's there. So he knows, because I even in my interview, I asked him, I said, Father Cyprian, you know, can you recall sort of that first meeting and Sister M. Martin DePorres Gray there? And he was very silent for a minute. And he said, she was there, wasn't she? And that was all he said. And I was like, oh, let me move on. And, you know, even with her, Dr. Gray, you know, for a long time, she would just, you know, we spoke for over 10 years. She and I are very close. She would just say it was an ugly confrontation. It took her a lot to even name the men who were the worst, what they did. But even after my book was in, it was not until my book was in a way to be published that she said, you know, we were talking one day and she said, you know, I don't even know. They surrounded me and screamed at me for about 30 minutes to leave. And she said, I don't even know how I stayed. And it shocked me because I was like, you didn't tell me that. And she said, you know, I know. That they surrounded her for 30 minutes and screamed at her to leave.
What was it that she was pushing for, that they were
just to simply be there? This is a moment in which the priests are about to seize this moment created by Dr. King's assassination. And they release a statement that will ultimately call sort of the Catholic Church primarily a white racist institution and call for greater decision-making power within the church. Because African-American priests, first of all, long before they're Black priests, they're Black nuns. And so most Black priests, those earliest generations of African-American priests were not allowed to minister in African-American parishes. Many of them were sent to Africa or sent to the Caribbean to become as missionaries. And that was a way in which white supremacy also operated, denying Black people formal leaders within their own parishes and within their own communities. Obviously, you have sisters there. And so these men, they're not young. Some of them are young, many of them are not, this is their moment for power. And, you know, she sort of pushes back. Eventually, a few priests stop it. What happened? And, you know, she's allowed to stay as an unofficial observer. So is an African-American brother. Because he's not an ordained priest, he was not initially allowed in, but they don't do what they did to him, what they did to her. But they are there as unofficial observers, so they are not recorded in the records because they are unofficial. And then, you know, there's this moment when they're writing this letter and she says, look, you are going to need the sisters. We likely outnumber you. Your vision of Black liberation is limited if you don't include the sisters. You will need us. And then she asks for Black sisters to be allowed to join the caucus. And then she says, and what she characterized as a moment of cowardice, they made her leave the room to take the vote so she would not know who voted against her. But she comes back and a few of them, you know, say, hey, well, maybe you should do your own thing. Do your own. She was like, there are some things you never say, do your own thing. She's like, that's what they said. And some of them were actually kind. And, you know, that is what will lead her to found the National Black Sisters Conference, which she already knew she had to do, because she was like, what was also very important in this moment, she said, what was really interesting, right? They're all telling their stories. They have these gut-wrenching experiences of discrimination within the church. But she was like, what scared me the most was that so many of them said they wanted to become bishops and monsignors, and how fearful they were of they didn't want to offend the church too much, which is why they say primarily a white racist institution as opposed to a white racist institution. They're hesitant. And so, she said, I was always fearful because I felt like if they became bishops, they would sell us out. And
Thank you.
so that's a part of it.
Thank you for sharing that. So we do have folks with questions. Just if you don't know how to raise your hand, please go to the bottom of your screen, hit the reactions button, or you can find your name in the participants list and raise your hand that way. Cody, you had your hand up first, and then we'll go to Kyle, and then we'll go to Adine.
Thanks, Lane. Yeah, brought up a whole bunch of stuff for me. Thank you so much. I loved all the details, and I thought years and years and years ago about being an Episcopal nun. I grew up in a very Protestant and Jewish environment with not a lot of Catholic influence, and I work in prison and find that there's a separation between the inmates who identify as Catholic and those who identify as Protestant. And that if you're Catholic, you're kind of a rung up. And mostly it has been, a lot of it has to do with education and the kids who were chosen to go to the Catholic schools or whatever, and at least my friends who are African-American and were educated in the Catholic system. But it's a very interesting dynamic. And I'd love it if you'd comment on that. And the other thing, I just wanted to say the whole passing thing and the sister who didn't want to implicate her sister who was passing. And I just, makes my heart ache. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Passing is very much a part of this story too. Some of the earliest Black sisters in white communities are sisters who were passing, right? Some communities were willing to make exceptions for women who could pass as long as they agreed that their families could never visit them in the community, right? So we have examples of that happening too. So it's a really fascinating story for those who are interested. In terms of sort of the dichotomies, even sort of between sort of African-American Catholics and Protestants, what's interesting, Catholic schools, right? Even though the Catholic Church has this really egregious sin history of white supremacy, and although Black Catholics, the Black Catholic population in the United States, even though I think we're being undercounted because they don't include Latinos and Latinas, and so there's something about undercounting us too, but significant numbers of African Americans have been educated in Catholic schools, even if they're not Catholic, right? We know that African American Catholics and Black African Americans educated in Catholic schools have a higher educational success rate than their counterparts, and so many African American Protestant or just non-Catholic parents oftentimes turn to the Catholic school system. Because it was private, sometimes they could get to smaller classrooms. It was still accessible for a lot of people. And so you do see upwardly mobile Black African-American parents turn to the Catholic educational system, sometimes simply trying to evade sort of non-existent public schools available to African-Americans, certainly to Jim Crow, but then also attempting to seek what they consider to be the best education for their children. We know that in certain cases, I've certainly seen it with Black African-Americans educated by white nuns, right? That they are taught to look down on others. We certainly see that sort of with the Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament in Chicago. There's some documentation of that. And so we certainly see that in play. What I would say is that we still need so much research. Believe it or not, the field of U.S. Black Catholic history is still in its infancy, right? We have Father Cyprian Davis's landmark study, but it is by no means a definitive study of the Black Catholic experience. Women, the roles of religious women, lay, and of Black Catholic women, religious and lay, are largely discounted, and we just need other histories. So I've heard that in oral histories. I've heard that anecdotally. It shows up in the archive. I don't know how widespread it is. I would also gather that perhaps it happens in certain kinds of schools and not in others, depending on who's ministering to them, who is the order of nuns ministering to them. We know that there are issues of color with regard to the second African-American sisterhood, the Sisters of the Holy Family, that are initially founded as a Creole community that exclude Native Americans and only sort of restrict their membership to women of elite background. And that they enforce segregation due to complaints from in their earliest years before the end of slavery, from Creole parents who do not want their children educated with children who were slaves or whose mothers were slaves. They sort of say that. So we'll see some of that classism sort of erupt in some of those spaces. I would say not so much in the schools founded by the Oblate Sisters of Providence. That community is an egalitarian community from the very beginning. They are educating free and enslaved children. They also admit women who were born into slavery into their ranks before the Civil War. And what I say in terms of Mother Mary Lange, who is one of 6 African-Americans on the road to Catholicism, who's the founders of the Oblate Sisters of Providence, she and the early Oblate Sisters of Providence are the essential counterpoints that we need when people try to defend their slaveholding and segregationist peers as people of their times. So many of their peers are slaveholdings, right? Some of whom are saints, right? And people try to say, well, how did we make slavers saints? Well, these were just people of their times. But my point is always, Mother Lange is also of those times. The Oblates do not own enslaved people. They let women born into slavery into their ranks. And in one case, at least, there's a woman who's still enslaved that comes into their community and gains her freedom before she professes her vows. And so this idea that Catholics did not understand that slavery was a moral evil is not true when we take Black sisters' story seriously. So it's a great question. I've seen it. I just don't know how widespread it is. It could be widespread, but I think we just need more studies to actually be able to sort of come to a general conclusion. But thank you so much for that.
Thank you, Dr. Williams. Thanks, Cody, for the question. Kyle, please unmute.
Thanks. Thank you for that presentation. That was brilliantly informative, and I learned a lot that I didn't know in detail from listening to you. So thanks for that. The question that I have is probably stemmed from my work that I do with prisoners at Amplified Silence. Generally, it involves exploring childhood and backgrounds, and I know in my own my religious experience was one that was rather isolating, if you will, socially. So I don't have much interaction with any other. Didn't have much exposure to other religious traditions in my childhood. So the question in short is, what is this identity? When you say, it sounds like you identify as a Black Catholic, and I'm trying to get a better understanding of what that means to you in the context of the structure that you've introduced to us. As an outsider, it's like, well, here's this organization that's so intertwined with racism and enslavement of my people. How do I reconcile that? Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that question. It's a question that I ask myself every day. How do I reconcile myself? How do I stay in this church? Knowing what I know and I didn't know initially. I am Catholic because my mother is Catholic, and my mother raised my sister and I Catholic. My father was Protestant. But for like big occasions, my sister and I did double duty, right? So we went to Easter Mass, but then we would also go to my father's rural Protestant church. So I knew different religious traditions, and I was allowed to, go to church with my friends. So I knew other religious traditions. I grew up in a predominantly white, and I shouldn't even say predominantly white, nearly all white Southern suburban parish. And that was in the 80s and 90s where there were no sisters left. Now, what's interesting enough, I didn't know there were Black nuns. I did know there were Black priests. I know that seems crazy that it didn't even occur to me that there were Black nuns. But in the early 1990s, the Diocese of Memphis, and I'm from Memphis, Tennessee, got its first African-American bishop in Bishop J. Terry Stein. And so I knew there were Black priests. But that was my only interaction or sort of introduction to what it meant to be a Black and Catholic. Bishop Stein and my mom who doesn't talk about Notre Dame and what happened at Notre Dame and doesn't talk about growing up Black and Catholic. For other people, right, there are Black folks who grew up in Black Catholic parishes, even if they had white priests, right? Those who were, and the parishes are interracial in the sense that the priest and the sisters may be white and everybody else is Black. But then you also have Black lay groups, especially the Knights of St. Peter Claver, which is the Black counterpart to the Knights of Columbus because they wouldn't accept Black folks. And they also have a ladies auxiliary. And so in a lot of those Black parishes, you know, parish life, Catholicism is just beautiful, right? Like, you know, it organizes the entire sort of structure of things. So what was really beautiful for me was to sort of interview Black sisters who came out of these historically Black parishes, those who sometimes were attached to Black nuns or attached to white nuns, but in reality, sort of the lay people sort of ran the show, if you will. And so they were also the counters to whatever sort of discrimination that they may even sort of encounter with white people who minister in their communities. Not just because white Catholics minister in Black communities does not signify a commitment to racial equality by any stretch of the imagination. Oftentimes, oh, I'm sorry. Mm-hmm.
No, I apologize, but I guess what I'm asking is given that, and like you said, you think about this question every day. Does that affect your interactions when you're dealing with white people who are Catholics, which I imagine you may have had to do in your research? Does that add or dimension or detract anything from that experience, given your awareness of your relation to your history?
Not anymore. It's a great question. Not anymore. When I came to this project, I should have also said that I was on my way out of the Catholic Church. I didn't know that I had a place within the church. I didn't know any of the history. So one of the first interviews that I did was also with Sister Mary Antonia Ebo. And that woman preached a word over my life and telling me her story. And it was really interesting because when I began as these women, and they were preaching, even as they were telling me their stories, I understood why these women did not leave the church and why other Black Catholics don't leave the church. They are not going to surrender their church to racists and others who cannot fully affirm the dignity and humanity of Black people. They see the church as theirs. Their history is older. If we look at this older history, right? Remember now, you know, there was that old version of Christianity, if you read my book, and those sisters who run the Jesuits out of Ethiopia, who were trying to sort of suppress the ancient tradition of Christianity in the 15th century and 16th century. And they run, these African nuns and African noble women run the Jesuits out. And so for me, it's been important for me, and that's how I sort of interact, you know, when people sort of say, oh, and sort of perceive me to be marginal, right? You know, I'm quick with my history, right? Like I can do that. A lot of Black Catholics don't do it because they don't teach Black Catholic history and they don't teach Black history in Catholic institutions. So for me, it's not hard anymore to push back against that. And hopefully what I hope my book will do too is give people sort of that handbook to be able to sort of, you know, we've been here. And actually, we're the moral compass of it all, right? You know, wherever the church has moved, it has been because of us. We are the moral compass of this as it relates to racism and every other interconnected issue, which is everything, right? That it has come from these Black Catholics, especially women and girls, who have been calling the church to be truly Catholic, but also calling our nation to be truly democratic. Like it matters that it's been the National Black Sisters Conference of all the Black orders who have been saying, y'all, if we don't get this right now, who've been outspoken, who are not ashamed to say Black Lives Matter, who are saying, if we don't get this right now, this is the end of the American democratic experience. It's been the Black nuns who have been most outspoken. And you cannot understand that in this moment without understanding the history and subversive habits, or at least that's my argument.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Kyle, and thank you, Dr. Williams. So we have 3 folks in the queue, Adine, Norman, and Dawn. We have about 12 minutes, maybe a little more, to get through those questions. So I just want to, you know, keep in mind our time. All right. So happy to have everybody asking these questions and this preacher answering them, because you are definitely preaching. It's good for you. All right, Miss Adine.
Can you hear me? Dr. Williams, your scholarship is outstanding. And you have been telling my story. I'm a Black Creole with a New Orleans background, all of my family, deeply Catholic. And the love that my relatives used to have for their parish communities was rich. My grandmother, my maternal grandmother, left New Orleans because she could not protect her octoroon daughters from white men. She was a widow. She moved to Chicago, right across the street from a large Catholic church in a mixed neighborhood in the 20s, large Catholic church with an attached Catholic school. Liking the discipline and the rigor of the Catholic educational system, She marched across the street with her 4 children in tow and was told by the priest that your kind can't attend school here. You'll have to go 10 miles down the road. My grandmother gave him a few very choice words, and when she marched back across the street, she was an atheist. So, you have summed up my life in a few words. Also about the misogyny, all organized religion is patriarchal. End of sentence.
Indeed. Indeed. I guess the thing, thank you so much. Well, first of all, thank you for sharing that story. I've heard so many. I think that's the piece that bothers me so much as a historian, especially when I was a young graduate student, and even now, you'll run into some scholarly circles who, when you hear these horrific stories of exclusion within the Catholic Church, you'll run into people, scholars, who will say, I never knew that. I just can't believe that that's the Catholic Church. And the reality is, I had to realize people, they're lying. It's everywhere. And it's, you know, and I didn't have to, you know, part of it, I thought people were intentionally gaslighting me. That's not that. They're not even doing that. When I was so scared, when I sort of found out about the segregationist policies of the Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament and actually what happened, and with some of these nuns who were saints, who were also either directly involved in slavery, exploited slave labor, or were slavers themselves, you know, I was sort of dealing with the fact and sort of a lot of backlash. How dare you call her a slaver? She's a saint. And what I realized almost immediately is that people were not defending their foundresses. They're defending themselves. Mm-hmm. They're defending themselves, those who put together these sainthood causes, and you erased the slaveholding, or you misrepresented the slaveholding or the segregation. You said it was one thing and it was the other. And when I realized that people were not defending them, they were not defending the saints, they were defending themselves, it helped me to understand it wasn't even personal. But it's interesting when we talk about the stories that I've collected, the horror stories. Like, I've heard horror stories of priests pistol whipping Black Catholics who dared to walk into a white parish or had the police called on them. The horrific things that happened. One priest refused to baptize a Black girl. Her father was Italian, her mother was African-American. It was like, in Brooklyn, you take them to St. Peter Claver. And she said her father never went back to the parish. Never went back to the parish. It's been, I just want to thank you for sharing that. And also in terms of the misogyny, it's there. I think in the Catholic Church, the other piece of it, right? You know, I just sort of tell people it's connected to something else that people need to sort of really pay attention to. I'll just leave it at that. But thank you so much.
Thank you. Norman.
I don't have a question. I just want to thank you for sharing, for writing your book, for just, I thoroughly enjoyed today. That's it.
Thank you so much. Thank you for being here. It's wonderful to be in community with you.
Thank you, Norman. All right, Miss Dawn, can we see your face? Can you turn your camera on?
Hi. Thank you so much for your scholarship. And I went to Catholic school, and I'm no longer involved in the Catholic Church, and often wonder how people who have this information, like Father Lucas in New York, continues to be in the church, one. And two, I wondered if you had heard of the Handmaids of Mary, which the name alone tells you a lot. They're still in existence, and those are the only Black nuns that I'm familiar with. They didn't teach me, but they were in Harlem, and that was their title, the Handmaids of Mary.
Yes, I do. So there have been 8 historically Black sisterhoods. The Handmaids, and I get the formal title, they were initially the Handmaids of the Most Pure Heart of Mary. Then they affiliated with the Franciscan order and became the Franciscan Handmaids of the Most Pure Heart of Mary. Were founded in Savannah, Georgia in 1916. after a law was introduced in the Georgia state legislature, which would have banned white teachers from teaching Black children and Black teachers from teaching white children. And that would have effectively barred Black children from attending the Catholic schools in Savannah because there were only white nuns ministering in Savannah at this time. And so they organized what became the Seventh African American Sisterhood. They found a pious lay woman who had been a part of a failed community in Convent, Louisiana, had been a former oblate novice. And she was actually working as a domestic for the Sisters of Notre Dame de Namur at their Trinity Washington College. Well, Trinity College, which is now Trinity Washington University. And she comes down and founds the community. And then they are run out of town by 1923. And that's why they settle in Harlem. So I did interview the handmaids, in particular, Sister Loretta Teresa Richards, who was their longtime Superior General. Without her personal archive, it would have been so much difficult because they have since transferred the mother house to Nigeria because they're under their first Nigerian non-American superior who was from Nigeria. Many of the handmaids, some of them are still living in Harlem. A lot of them are in a nursing home in the Bronx, but then the mother house now, they sold the mother house in Harlem. And they are now in Nigeria. But the handmaids are also an important part of that story, obviously, because they are the only Catholic sisterhood to be founded in direct protest of a Jim Crow segregation law. Mm-hmm. So a beautiful story that I do cover at every turn that I can. Unfortunately, they lost a lot of their archives. Nobody really knows where they are. The Society of African Missions has some of Mother Theodore's, who was their foundress's, letters. I was never given access to their archives, so for whatever reason. But the handmaids are there. So if you're looking for a story, you'll see them very much incorporated in Subversive.
Thank you for that. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for your questions. We may have time for one more question, but right now I'm going to turn it back over to Alex.
You're silent. You're on mute, Alex.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Williams. So if you could tell us this in a few seconds, what are next steps for you professionally and or spiritually in this journey?
Absolutely. Thank you for that question. I'm going to be writing about Black Catholics for the rest of my days. The oral testimonies are so rich. I don't even get to, as I say in the end of the book, I haven't even begun to tell you about what the stories of Black Catholic women, sisters, and lay women are in the Catholic Church. So the next project is literally pulling together the oral testimonies that I can use and put them in a book, because so much of what I've told you is not even in the book, right? That's just in the oral testimonies that I know and I have. I'm also working on a documentary history of Black Catholic women in the United States, religious and lay. I am convinced that there are about 15 to 20 Black lay women that we can trace every major development in the U.S. Catholic Church, in the Black Catholic community too. What's really interesting, just one little piece, Sister M. Martin DePorres Gray, who was Dr. Patricia Gray, it took me years before we sort of figured out that her mother came out of this Black parish in Atlantic City, New Jersey, that had been founded by this lay woman, Mother Emma Lewis. And then we found out that her grandparents were founding members of that Black parish. And then we had found that her grandmother had come out of Catholic Maryland. And I said, I told you, I said, I can tell you there's a Black lay woman in all these places that we can sort of trace everything to. So that's the next two projects. A couple more projects that I'm holding on to. Spiritually, I'm still in the church. It's hard. It's hard. That's all I can say. It remains a challenge, especially in this moment in which it's not clear that the American democratic experiment is going to hold, right? And what is the Catholic Church's role in this moment? I've been screaming the name of Susanna Queen every time I, hear something else about what's going on. And she was a Black lay woman who was enslaved by the Jesuits, who we also believe had 2 children fathered by one of the Jesuits. I mean, he leaves the children record, so there's that history that I've just been screaming about recently. So I think like many Black Catholics, we're still hanging on. We're doing so in the face of continued closures of Black Catholic schools and parishes in a church that, you know, has not been and refuses to be fully a living witness for all of us. But I stay, and I stay because I'm not gonna let anybody run me out of my church. But I do wonder what the next step is for me. I'm still struggling, which I think is a good thing, because if I was content at this moment, there would be something wrong with me. So that's where I am right now. I'm committing myself to telling Black Catholic stories, telling Black Catholic women's stories in particular, and fighting to remain in the church, and hopefully, you know, get our church to actually sort of address the need and actually pay out on reparations that it owes, not only for colonialism, but also slavery and segregation, so that we can survive this, but also thrive in this. And if necessary, make our exit to save ourselves. So thank you. Thank you again for this opportunity. It's truly been a pleasure to be in community with everyone. I'm so full and honored and grateful. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your witness to truth telling and justice. You know, for really, I mean, for me personally, it's, you know, you're bringing us to a deeper level of what Catholicism is all about, and also what this so-called democratic society is really supposed to be about. So thank you, and all power to you. Thank you for your just tremendous, beautiful witness.
Thank you.
Reverend Lane.
Thank you, Alex. We do have another couple of minutes. I wanna, and Linda, I see your hand up, so I want you to ask your question, but we're gonna need to have it kind of short, because I also want to make sure we hear from Dr. Williams what her call to action for us is. So Linda, go ahead.
Thank you. I just wanted to, as an excommunicated Catholic myself, you actually give me hope to want to try to get back in, and maybe there's hope for the church. I'm shocked you haven't been excommunicated by the patriarchal powers that be. And my quick question for you is, do you see that the work that you're doing is shifting the hearts and minds of the white power system in the Catholic Church? Or is it simply just keep going it because you're not going to get run out? Do you see any shifting of hearts and minds? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. At the end of my book, Subversive Habits, I do tell the story of a powerful reconciliation that took place between Dr. Patricia Gray and the Sisters of St. Joseph of Baden in Pennsylvania. I mentioned that she was Pittsburgh's first Black religious sister of mercy, but before she desegregated that community in 1961, she was rejected admission into the Sisters of St. Joseph of Baden, who were the sisters that she knew, who had educated her. And I say this because I told that story in London in 2015. And it just so happened that a member of that community who was on their leadership team was there at my presentation in London. And she was horrified. And she would have entered the same year as Dr. Gray. And she immediately went back to her community. And the leader of her community at the time was also the head of the Leadership Conference of Women Religious. And they immediately started going through the process. They wanted to apologize. They wanted to make it right. And I, for one, had never realized that my work could potentially facilitate. I'd never sort of even imagined that my work could facilitate that kind of reconciliation. And sort of begin that work of reparation. And so there are some other examples of communities. I would not have been able to do what I did without a lot of white sisters giving me access that I couldn't get, a lot of white sisters telling me stories that they had been hanging on to. So I've certainly seen it on an individual level and in some cases an institutional level, but obviously more work needs to be done. And don't get me wrong, I don't know if I pray I won't get excommunicated, but if they do throw me out, that means I'm not supposed to be in the church anyways, because if you're gonna throw me out for telling the truth, then I don't need to be in an institution that does not value the truth, and the true truth at that. So I'm hopeful of my ability to stay in the church. I'm not hopeful about the state of the country. You know, so the call to action is we need to get serious about reparations. And I mean that on a very real level. What is owed needs to be paid from the Catholic Church, but also from the US government, because people, if we're sort of paying attention to what potentially is coming, people need to be able to run. And I mean that. People need to be able to take care of themselves. And what is holding a lot of people back right now is just simply they don't have the ability to run. And so when we talk about racial justice, if if reparations for colonialism, slavery, and segregation are not a part of that, we can't even get to justice, let alone reconciliation and peace. But right now we have to get very serious about reparations and transformative reparations. Money in people's hands, because this was a financial exploitative system. It was a violent system. Yes, spiritual reparations, but we also need to talk about that in really meaningful ways, mandating the teaching of Black and Black Catholic history in Catholic institutions and seminaries and religious formation institutes for every Catholic to sort of understand that this is their history, that this history of white supremacy is one that Catholics must also acknowledge, bear witness to, and remember for the rest of their lives, and for the remaining existence of the Catholic Church. But that's where I am right now. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Wow. I don't know if you've been watching the chat, but people are just throwing love at you all over. You've really, really made an impact this afternoon with us today, Dr. Williams, and we just are so grateful. Many of us, some of us on the broadcast are familiar with the work of Myra Brown, who's only the third Black Catholic woman priest in the United States. I did not know that, but if you are not familiar with her and would like to talk with her, we would like to connect you. So that was put in the chat to me. Alex certainly knows her. I just want to, again, thank you. And you know what you said about reparations, wow, powerful. And we would love to have a conversation about that as well. Anytime you would like to come back and talk about your work, you are more than welcome. Thank you so much. I know that a whole lot of folks are going to be circulating this recording of this program. Just thank you so much. And I've put the link to your book in several times, but again, I want to say Dr. Shannen D. Williams, the title of her book is Subversive Habits, Black Catholic Nuns in the Long African-American Freedom Struggle, and it is available on Duke University Press. Thank you to my co-host, Alec McCulloch. You can find Alec's book on Amazon, Unlearning White Supremacy, A Spirituality for Racial Liberation, published by Orbis Books, available on Amazon. I also wanted to let you know that you are welcome to come back next week. Please join us. We are going to have another inclusive, courageous conversation about race in America. We are going to have a panel discussion about maternal health disparities in communities of color. My co-host will be AJ Woodson. As always, we remind you to please connect with people who don't look or live like you for meaningful dialogue about race, or just to get to know each other better. We're all in this together, and it takes all hands on deck. If you're on our mailing list, please be sure to check out the learning and development resources that we send out each week. And if you'd like to be on our mailing list and don't think you are, please go to info@racetalkrevolution.com. Lastly, if you have topics for ideas for topics or speakers that you would like us to feature, please contact me also there at info@racetalkrevolution.com. And if you're feeling generous and you'd like to make a donation, you can do so on the website at racetalkrevolution.com. We will be hosting another book study, and I am interested in your ideas for books that you would like us to discuss. So you can send those to me. Please let me know what are some titles that have influenced you. And who knows, we may do Dr. Williams' book. I don't know. Alex, I'm going to turn that back over to you for closing words, my friend.
Well, again, just deepest thanks, Dr. Williams, for really extraordinary witness to truth-telling and justice. All of your work, all the pain and struggle you've endured. May you just keep on keeping on in the struggle. All grace, peace, and blessings to you. Thank you for a wonderful conversation today. And thank you to the entire Race Talk Revolution family. Have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody. Thanks to our new folks. Please come back. Thanks on Facebook. Take care, everybody. Have a great week. Dr. Williams, thank you so much. Thank you. God bless you.